Good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are based, right? It's Dario from Next Pharma Summit, and really pleased to start this very interesting panel with the title Engaging with Patient, Payer, Physician Ecosystem, Lessons from Rare Diseases for a Post-COVID World. Really pleased to introduce John from Novasecta. Hi, John, how are you?
Fine. Yep, good to see you.
Camilla Hartwig from Alexion. Hi, Camilla, how are you?
Hi, Daria, I'm fine.
Vlad from IHP Therapeutics. Hi, Vlad, how are you? Hello?
Yep.
And Adrian from Orchard Therapeutics. Adrian, how are you?
Hey, Dario. Hi, everyone. Good, thanks.
Yep. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Great. Well, Dario, many thanks for asking me to host this, and it's a pleasure meeting you all. It's a pleasure being able to facilitate this panel. The way I'd like to do this is give a very brief introduction to who is around the room here, or around the virtual room, I should say. And then we'll get stuck in straight into the topic. I'll give the quickie on me, John Roundtree. I'm a partner at Novasecta. We are a pharmaceutical strategy consulting firm focused on helping people make better strategic decisions, improve their ways of working, and have better collaborations. What I'd like to do is introduce the team first, and then we'll structure the discussion into 3 parts. I'll explain that in a moment. But yeah, delighted to have the team with me. So if any one of the 3 of you, Camilla, Adrian, and Vlad, would just like to start, give us a bit about yourself, your background and company, and what you get up to, that would be fantastic, so people know who we're listening to. So I was going to go with, I'll have to name you first, Camilla, then to start, if you like.
Okay, of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Camilla Hartwig. I'm the Senior Vice President of International in Alexion. We are obviously 100% focused on rare disease and how we serve our patients. And that's literally our mission in life in Alexion. It's really exciting. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry, I'm not going to say how many years, but it's many, many, many years. It's the only thing I've ever done. And my passion is clearly how we serve our external stakeholder ecosystem. So I'm really, really happy to be here with you all.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Camilla. Vlad, do you want to go next? Still having trouble hearing you, but perhaps you can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead. That's great.
Good afternoon. My name is Vlad Hogenhaus. I'm a board member of IHP Therapeutics, a startup in San Francisco. Formerly, I was Chief Operating Officer of Ultragenyx, a company focused on rare diseases. As a physician, I think there's no higher value in bringing therapeutics to the patients and families with rare diseases. And that's my passion in life, continue to be, and look forward to this great panel and learning a couple of things from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Great stuff, Vlad. Thank you. And Adrian?
Thank you, John. So my name is Adrian Lemoyne. I'm Chief Business Officer for Orchard Therapeutics. So we are a 5-year-old startup company doing ex vivo HSC gene therapy for rare diseases, with the ambition to try to really fix at the root core genetic defect and provide as close as can be as a cure to patients that we treat. And we have a portfolio of programs spanning approved product to discovery, and to try and help us do that. And I'm so very keen to be on that panel, hopefully share a few insights that we collected along the way, along the Orchard 5-year tenure, and hopefully help other companies in the field.
Excellent. Well, thank you all, and it's going to be a real pleasure talking with you. What we've got, I decided to structure this in 3 parts, so we've agreed with the folk beforehand. One is actually this patient, payer, physician ecosystem. Rare diseases is special, I think you've heard already from the introductions, and there's a way of engaging with that ecosystem that is special and different. I think there are lessons for many across the whole industry in that, about what makes it special and why it's different, and what people are doing about that. The second bucket of topics is really about have this COVID-19 overlay to the rare disease context, and sort of how are companies adjusting to that COVID-19 thing, and how particularly the rare disease companies engaging with that, because I think they're closer to the patient perhaps than some other specialty and primary care organizations. So how are they adjusting to that COVID context? And finally, we'd like to look at the internal ways of working of how those companies are actually managing it internally to make sure that they're managing effectively externally. So I'll allow about sort of a third of the topics on each of those as we go through, but I'm going to get straight into it really with this managing the patient payer physician ecosystem and how companies are doing that in rare diseases nowadays. And what I'd like to do is start with each panel member just giving a little bit of a share of an element where they think there's a particular uniqueness that they've seen and that how they're dealing with it, and then we can evolve from there. So I can either ask for a volunteer or I can nominate again. So please go ahead, guys. You know, a particular element of engaging with the system that you feel is particularly interesting for the people participating today.
Happy to start with one of.
Go ahead, Adrian.
Everybody at once. Adrian, go first. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll start with one of the earliest elements that we need to do right in rare disease, which is the diagnosis, which often difficult, sometimes takes years for patients to get a proper diagnostic of a condition that eludes the knowledge of most specialists that they see until they find someone who really understands the rare instance that they're faced with. And it's all the more true for genetic disease, where you also need a diagnostic as soon as you can, because this disease will start to do damage from the first hours of life of the patient, even sometimes in utero. So efficient diagnostic and as quickly as can possibly be done is essential, which also leads more and more to the development of newborn screening and the extension of more disease being diagnosed from birth, adding to the panel of bringing a handful to 50 about in the US that are being tested around birth. But the hope is more and more of the disease can be tested as the cost of testing goes down, in particular genetic testing. And I think it's a very, very important component for our industry. We've seen so many stories of patients struggling to get a name on their condition and a treatment, hopefully, everyone that can help alleviate the symptoms. And this, everything we can do to accelerate this is critical.
And anything particular that Orchard is sort of experimenting with to help with that? You mentioned screening, sort of getting involved in those programs. It's not the classic thing that a pharmaceutical company necessarily engages with, is all the diagnostic end of things. And how are you finding that bridge? Because I think it's increasingly important that people do diagnose effectively in all indications.
Absolutely. And one way to go about it that we have currently ongoing is to fund the pilot studies where you will run normal screening in a particular region of the world, in a state, in the US, in a catchment area or an hospital in Italy, for instance, to demonstrate that first there's a test that can work, and two, you can find patients early enough, and three, by finding them, you can offer them a treatment early enough before the patient's symptoms are irreversible or too far gone. So you make then the case to regulators that this test should be included in panels. It's cost effective to test safe and to treat them early, as opposed to see them living a life of suffering because they couldn't be treated on time for those diseases in particular, like disease of CNS, who are reversible as degeneration happens. So it's really for the industry to help and set up these pilots to demonstrate that screening is a good thing to implement, and that's obviously quite unique to our field.
It'll be interesting to hear the other Camilla or Vlad, any experience of that diagnostic end and things you've done about it, the screening, other things that you've sort of found a way to just identify your patients early.
Well, it's definitely something that we have focused on and off within Alexion. We keep having a conversation around how do we approach this in the right way, and we do have some major global projects running that will help us, especially in some of our newer diseases as well. So I completely agree with Adrian that it's also a piece of work that we have to look at and that we have to feel responsible for, especially in rare disease. So I hope that answered. Yeah,
certainly, yes, that would be good. Yeah.
And Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, Vlad, please answer John's question.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so John, I think the statistics for diagnosing patients are just astounding. On average, and I'm sure everybody on this panel knows that, it takes a patient 7 years from the start of symptoms to actually being diagnosed by a patient. And by that time, they have been seen by at least 3 specialists who have, referred the patient to a new specialist because they can help it. So the burden on the patient and on their family is just astounding, because they would have gone to each of these specialists and not gotten a resolution of what is actually bothering them. So when you consider that, a lot of the rare disease patients are being treated by the reference centers, as a company, it's relatively easy to kind of go to these reference centers and service each of them. The hard part is when you have to climb higher in the tree and actually to find those patients. And so one of the programs that companies are doing is actually using artificial intelligence, using billing codes, imaging codes, laboratory codes, ICD-9 or now ICD-10 codes, to actually determine the patients with the highest probability of having the disease. And once you find a concentration of, say, 1 or 2 of those patients with a particular provider, you can actually meet with that physician, or in COVID-19, actually reach out via teleconference and educate the physician about that particular rare disease, educate how to diagnose this, educate them on potentially specialists that are in their near area to which they could actually refer them, and tell them a little bit about the therapy that your company offers to actually provide not just an intellectual exercise of diagnosing the patient, but actually providing a real solution at the end. And at a former company, Ultragenyx, we now have had really perfected that approach, having a relatively high ROI using that artificial intelligence data dredging approach, and finding, the patients who actually had the symptoms but never actually met somebody who could diagnose them. So that really gives you an example of how you can actually service the physician and the patient alike.
Yeah, it's great to hear that you're sort of moving backwards, from the traditional pharma approach of the physician focus and really back into the patient to, first of all, diagnose them, and secondly, find out some patterns about them. And I think that's the hallmark of the companies that are dealing with these rare diseases. And Camilla, you mentioned earlier in your introduction about the sort of passion for connecting to those patients, and perhaps Vlad mentioned something about the the patient centers and the physicians, how you can help work with them. Is there anything you're thinking that this centers of excellence and patient organizations that you feel that is particularly important here in the rare disease world?
I absolutely think that they are particularly important, but I actually always come back to, John, that it's the collaboration across all stakeholders that is truly paramount in rare disease, because the sheer complexity of our diseases and also the limited awareness and the understanding of the many conditions is really, really low. So I think the way we include stakeholders, the way we involve them, the way they involve each other and on the patient pathway is incredibly important. And I think one of the many conversations we have is around how do we become better in creating this collaboration already from the get-go, so that when we actually do clinical trials, that we have interviews with patients, that we make sure we listen to what is it that they need. And obviously in a time where we talk about diversity, making sure that the patients we learn from, that it's a diverse group of patients, not just the one we have easy access to. So I think that's another piece that we really need to think about, and that means from the get-go involving them a lot more.
And you say from the get-go, you're talking about quite a lot in the with the investigators during the clinical trial process, and then following that right through commercialization, I guess.
Yeah, it's making sure that the patients are involved in this. And I will never forget when in Barcelona I was at this children's hospital, and we were in the patient section, and they had an ad board by children that would be invited to tell pharmaceutical companies actually what they needed out of a clinical trial. And I thought that was absolutely phenomenal.
That's great. No, it's a really nice way to engage everybody in the process. And actually, it's not just focused on the patient, it's finding a way for the whole ecosystem, because it's almost direct and indirect, isn't it, through the physicians and so on. And you know, I think that's really good. We haven't, it'd be interesting to talk about any other challenges. I mean, we've got the diagnosis, we've got the engaging the whole collaboration side of it. Are there any other bottlenecks, if you like, that you guys have found that particular to rare disease that you think may need a little bit of extra attention in managing this ecosystem? Things that are harder or things that are actually more straightforward that you can think about?
Yeah, I can bring one up, which is quite specific to gene therapy, which is becoming a very important modality for rare disease, because most are genetic in origin, which is pricing. So obviously here, it's a whole different game. You sell a single treatment that promise ideally a lifetime, if not many, many years of efficacy, very different from a chronic therapy, which has been the hallmark of rare disease treatments to date. So you bring a lot of value to the system, but how do you recognize that value in a single instance or a single payment? And a few of our colleagues in the industry and the artists with Asma, for instance, been trying to make this model work and be flexible with payers, who sometimes balk at the idea of paying a couple of $1 million upfront for a therapy that is worth it, but which represents a significant cash outlay a single year, and the fear that one day you have thousands of patients on the plan or in the country turning up for a multi-million therapy, which is cost effective, but not necessarily affordable to outlay all that cash in one single year. So it's about being creative with the payer, finding a way to come up with schemes where you spread payment over time, for instance, and link it to continuous success. So the promise of lifetime treatment is checked at a different time point and reassessed. That if it doesn't work anymore, then there's a reimbursement of sorts between industry and the payer. So it's been very interesting field, very new, because there's only a handful of gene therapies approved to date in both US and Europe. But I think we'll see more and more creative schemes between industry and payers, contracts that really enable access to treatment, enable the industry to be get a return on their investment, and make patient get access to treatment in the end, which is the most important.
Got it. Yeah.
John, I also think that in many cases, and at least what I've seen throughout my career, where I've worked with much larger patient groups than you see within rare disease, many of these patient groups don't have a very strong voice. They are very often patients themselves, and that's why they are so passionate about bringing their voice somewhere where it can be heard. But they are not as big as the British Hypertension Society or some other major group that are used to being part of the lobbying. So I think one of the important pieces of work that we have to do is to help them to really create that voice. It's obviously their voice, it's not our voice, so everything has to be appropriate, of course. But that's a major difference that I see coming from a very different part of the pharmaceutical industry into rare disease.
That's it. Very interesting. Yeah, it's the patient organizations. Yeah, Vlad, I think you're going to add something there. Yeah.
I fully agree with Camilla on the patient organizations. Kind of enabling them to achieve their aspirations is kind of a major opportunity to help them. The area that I was going to offer as an example of a cross collaboration within a company is, after you originate, diagnose the patient, it's starting the therapy that is often a huge hurdle, because a number of players need to come together and be aligned. One is, of course, the patient and their family, and they're bewildered. They may have a new diagnosis, and they don't know sometimes where to start, of how the product will be administered, how actually the product will get reimbursed, and often expensive therapies that they cannot afford, I think, as Adrian addressed. And so helping the ecosystem between patient, provider, the nurse practitioner who often injects the medicine, the pharmacy that dispenses the product. It's just a bewildering array of people that all need to be aligned on one goal. And so often companies engage with case managers or their patient hub to really align in filling out first the reimbursement form that changes from managed care company to managed care company, but making sure that every field, every diagnostic test, every lab value, every imaging element that is required for reimbursement is either correctly done and filled out. And then shepherding that reimbursement form through the managed care organization, through the payer, at every step there are hurdles. And it's simply impossible for many of these rare disease families to take that on. So the patient hub helps patiently to get through that particular system. And then comes the point of actually the pharmacist dispensing this expensive product from a specialty pharmacy to the nurse who's actually going to administer medicine potentially the first time in the physician's office, which is again an alignment of scheduling that looks simple, but nothing is simple for a family with a rare disease that have already a high burden of taking care of their sick family member. So the patient hub also helps with that scheduling and ensures the follow-up visits are done according to the label, that the injections are not missed, and that the lab values are recorded to make sure that the medicine has the effect. So the company really has a responsibility for having an effective patient hub that takes care of that start process soup to nuts. And the better you're at it, the more patients you can help. And that's really part of the mission of what actually a good rare disease company does.
So in this concept, the patient hub is something that the pharma company is facilitating rather than leading, I guess. It's back to the collaboration thing rather than the, this isn't an internal organization.
It is an internal. It is. I wasn't clear. This is an internal team within the company that is employed by the company and actually facilitates all of these processes.
It's interesting because that is something that other companies don't have, but it may become increasingly important. It's taking responsibility for the whole treatment of the patient, and I've certainly heard from other contexts that often trying to get a patient to actually accept that they want to be treated is often a challenge too, even though they know they're ill. It's a difficult, always a very difficult area. So it's a very interesting how those how you're organizing those patient hubs. Just want to come back briefly to the creative pricing point from Adrian made earlier on, and because we talked about the physician and the patient and the hospital system of getting diagnosed and treated, but of course there is the payer end of this as well, which you alluded to, I guess, Vlad, too. And I just wondered if people could give us some sense of the nature of the creativity that's going on in pricing in rare diseases, because I think again that could be a precursor for other rollouts in the rest of the industry in terms of that creativity. What have you mentioned? I think contracts, and it's a new way of thinking about price of pharmaceuticals. It'd be good to hear your insights on those topics too from around the panel.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, John. It's another area where rare disease is probably going to lead the way or pave the way and test creative solutions that will then percolate into less niche areas of medicine. Because in the end, you want a medication to do what it says on the tin. If payers get in the habit of ascertaining that what they pay for works in rare disease, you could see that eventually permeating into larger indications. Obviously, it requires huge infrastructure to do that, and we'll have to see whether it's worth doing or implementing at scale. Even in rare disease, we do see some payers say, well, I don't want to implement too complex a scheme for the sake of a handful of patients. I will just give you the money up front, because the work, the paperwork, the bureaucracy, to track patients for is not worth my time. I'm just going to give you the money, and then we shake hands and we trust you it's going to work. But I do see very well, as we've seen on the field like diagnosis, how rare disease can be a beacon for larger indication when it comes to pricing schemes.
That's very good, because I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Is that
No,
Camilla?
I just wanted to say that perhaps I'm not so keen on the word in creative, rather innovative, or how you collaborate. And actually, I think one of the things that we are very focused on is making sure that the interest groups and the payers and the governments that we speak to, that we educate them around the benefit and the value of treatments in rare disease, because normally they will come to the table with a completely different view of that than we will. And then I think it's our job to really create that education so that many more interest groups and stakeholders actually understand the value that it brings. And that can take some innovation in terms of how we talk about it, how we discuss it, what type of data we bring, but I really think it's about educating the stakeholder or the ecosystem of our stakeholders to understand what this means for any specific patient that has a rare disease.
Very interesting. It's because actually there's a question come through on the chat about patient advocacy organizations, whether somehow collaborating with them on the pricing. It'd be interesting, any perspectives on how you can, yeah, I mean, we talked about patient advocacy before, but you know, are those organizations, is it educating them, collaborating with them, or do they have, do you feel that you can sort of build a common thread of that case, if you like, for the rare disease pricing through the patient organizations to influence the pricing of these things? Be interested in any experiences on that front.
It's certainly important to educate the patient organizations. I think Camilla even made that point. I think it's important for them to be able to understand, you know, why the price was set at a certain level, but also help them consistently educate payers around the need for treating the patients, the sequelae of the disease, and what the therapy can do for them. Because often patients, organizations are being invited around the table, either national organization discussion, national reimbursement discussions, or as is the case in the US, they're sometimes invited by managed care organizations to share their plight and share what the medicine has actually done for them. So if they can consistently educate, to Camilla's point, these payers around the benefit, there's, I think, a great opportunity for education. And sometimes they, when they are denied reimbursement as part of the prior authorization process, having them appropriately appeal the decision with the right arguments that other patients may have successfully used, that's a really great opportunity for the patient organizations to help one another and help the cause of their patients by giving them the consistent speaking points to the managed care organization.
That's a great point. It's what's come across, if you like, at this first area about engaging the ecosystem. It is a complex ecosystem. There are a lot of players, and it's about education and communicating, collaborating across all fronts. It's not just singular, and I think that's really powerful. It'd be really interesting to now overlay this with the COVID-19 context, which is, you know, in a world where you're supposed to collaborate, get stakeholders together. I'm sure it was more straightforward when there were people that could actually go and talk to each other without having to get on a Zoom call or a GoToWebinar call. It'd be really interesting if we just switch gears a little bit to that adjustments that you've seen are the most important ones that you've had to make. It may be related to the stakeholders, it may be related to something else, but just a few thoughts on what is making it more difficult about the COVID-19 context and how you guys are dealing with it.
But John, maybe I can just add the other view that it actually wasn't more difficult because we all had a burning platform. And when you have a similar burning platform, you rally together in a way that you perhaps haven't had to do before. So I think what we saw was a real interest to actually create that collaboration. So for example, we could think about home infusion instead of these many patients who were actually denied to come to hospital to get their infusions. And I think Was it up to 50% of patients that were or rare disease patients that were struggling to get access to their medicine at different moments in time? And again, that suddenly created this really powerful common cause that we have to help the patients. So I saw a willingness that was actually more powerful than what I've ever seen before.
It's really good to hear. Yeah, so people really wanted to fix this problem and actually come up with solutions that were quite different, or maybe have been a little bit on the back burner, but now came front, like home infusions and so on.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. So it created the tension in the system. Yeah. Adrian, did you have any other thoughts on those adjustments that you're finding? Because that's a really interesting start point.
Yeah, the challenge we've seen, and I think everyone has seen in the industry beyond rare disease, is running trials. When patients are limited in their ability to travel to sites or to countries, which is even more true in rare disease, where you only have a small number of sites being open, and by nature, patients can come in from all around the world. So yeah, we have a trial, for instance, these days, with a site in Europe where we have a patient from Australia, who's a very young patient who has to travel with family, to have to navigate between quarantines and lockdowns, airlines not fulfilling flights anymore, has been quite challenging for us. And we've seen sadly a few companies having to pause trial during COVID because of the difficulty to get patients to move to sites for either or follow-up visits, which is interesting because to me, one of the positives of that is the acceleration of remote control of a patient in a trial, so that you don't have to go every 2 or 3 months to the same sites that is the lead in the site of investigation to get you checked, to get assessed. I think it's going to push more and more for in particular simple tests to be done more locally, and then the result being sent electronically to the primary investigator, which I think a welcome development. Obviously, some tests are complex. You need qualified personnel to administer select diagnostic metrics. But for a lot of the simple tests, like a blood draw, I mean, you don't need to go to a particular site to get your blood drawn and then analyzed. It can be done in most hospitals around the world. I do hope it will accelerate that because it's in the benefit of patients. And finally, by reducing the travel time to hospitals during a trial, it's much more comfortable if you can do that from your hometown or even locally, sending the sample taken by a nurse from home, then sent to hospital.
Interesting. Back to the hospital to home, it's prompted or encouraged, a bit like Camilla was saying. It's sort of, well, let's get something so people can be infused at home. Let's get something so people don't have to go for the routine tests. So almost deliberately overcoming those, what were inefficiencies in the system, essentially, of getting the patient treated. The COVID has paradoxically kind of pushed things to make it more convenient for the future, which is encouraging, I guess. I mean, it's different ways of making sure patients get the treatment that they really need. So that's that. Yeah. Okay. I mean, are any other the COVID-19? It's encouraging both from the point of view of getting the patient treated and also in the clinical trials. Any other things where COVID-19 has kind of added a layer into this that is perhaps a little bit more complex than it was before for you folks?
Well, one part goes to the diagnosis of the patient. We talked about the trials, generating evidence, obviously there's solutions around that, and then it's treating the patients, and you can leverage probably your patient hub to be more effective in providing that home care administration. The diagnosis is also an important part because often patients are reluctant to travel outside of the home. They may perceive that their disease potentially compromises their immune system. They're very loath to be exposed to COVID-19 for a diagnosis. So what's really Also, a solution that you can leverage is the at-home diagnostics to ensure that if a genetic test exists, whether it's a screening panel that screens for a number of diseases that are part of the differential diagnosis of the condition that you can help, or a confirmatory single gene test that actually singles out the gene defect for which you have a solution, you can actually partner with a diagnostic company for the test to be administered at home. This could be a simple saliva collection that can be collected in a tube, that can be sent through a postal carrier into the diagnostic hub, and then the results get disseminated back to the physician within 2 weeks so that you don't lose. So this is another element of continuing helping patients through diagnostic solutions that can be done at home through the genetic test.
Yeah, so it's again a very interesting twist that it's sort of finding ways to access the patient in their homes and making it more convenient for them, either to be diagnosed or to be in a trial or actually to be treated. How about the patient organizations? I mean, some of these must have been struggling with the whole COVID thing too, because they're traditionally very close to their patients. I mean, how can pharma engage with those patient organizations, if you like, to help them with this COVID thing? Do you think is it possible that you can help those in a compliant way? Have you found ways to do that?
I think that we can help them once we have learned how we are fully virtual and digital. Obviously we can bring some of those skills and capabilities to them, which is obviously a completely objective conversation with them around how do they want to communicate with their patients. And I think it's something that I'm sure every single company are working on today. What is the format of this? How do we do this? How do we do this well? I also find it interesting that when you ask HCPs these days, what do they prefer? 50% of them actually prefer a virtual connection instead of a face-to-face. And maybe they are still answering within the COVID-19 uncertainty, but it's a pretty high number, right? And so I know that everybody has gone gung-ho into this and everybody thinks they're great. I still think we have a lot to learn about how we actually do it well. But once we know that, we can then also perhaps safely bring that to patient organizations so that they have a safe way of how they connect. Because this is probably not the last time we have a pandemic like this in the world.
Probably not, no. So it's finding a way to make it safe for them to connect, but also to recognize that many people would actually like to, at least at the moment, connect virtually. And I think it's often the pharmaceutical company may have a lot more skill in that digital IT area than perhaps some of these very passionate, but perhaps less well sort of infrastructured patient organizations. So I think there's a role that the pharma companies can play in that, I guess, and actually make it more effective for them, because I think it's back to using the ecosystem, I suppose, to the benefit of the patient. Very, very interesting. So I suppose this patient support programs are something that we had talked about earlier in the conversation of making a way to help those patients as a group. And I don't know, I think this was probably something that came from Vlad. You're reaching the patient support programs when we had the previous discussion. Just perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that, how that's adjusted in the COVID world.
So I think with less, face-to-face context opportunity because of the COVID risks, there is just an increased burden opportunity and, quite frankly, responsibility of the patient hub to step in and to kind of ensure that the right conversations are taking place between the physician and the patient, whether that's the diagnosis or the follow-up or checking whether the treatment is working, between the patient organization and actually the home nurse to ensure that no appointments are being missed, between the pharmacist and the patient to ensure that any concerns, side effects, or follow-up questions are being answered. and with the managed care organization between patient, physician, to ensure, and payer, to ensure that any kind of follow-up questions, recertification is being done. So with COVID-19, the workload, the burden, and the sophistication of your patient hub goes up, but it is kind of, you know, a channel that you can activate and then have some of the other channels, the web channel, the distribution channel, play an increasingly support role. So it's really the basis is the hub exists, but then the different elements of the patient hub adapt to the situation where the face-to-face contact is not taking place, to ensure that the IT means of engagement pick up the slack.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, because another interesting question which is related to this is the, you know, this, if I guess, shift from personal connection to more digital connection is, you know, it's pervasive across all stakeholders. But how do you think, you know, it's going to look like in terms of the balance of digital versus face-to-face in the future in terms of engaging with stakeholders in this rare disease world? And you know, do you see the ways that people are communicating across that remaining, or, you know, keeping ahead of the stakeholder needs, if you like? And perhaps a little bit using it like an opportunity that both Camilla and Adrian mentioned at the beginning, just future ways that this engagement can be improved, because it's such a fundamental part of the system.
Interesting, because we've seen a few of our MSLs, for instance, having well, much better access to physicians through digital engagement.
Right.
That face-to-face, because it's easier to find time, to find slots. You're more flexible to meet with the KOL or the physician's needs. You can slot in quickly between two meetings, so it doesn't require finding a meeting room in the hospital, which sometimes can be challenging. There's a lot of small operational stuff that come into play that made actually the MSL visits, or potentially I assume as well the sales rep visits, a little bit easier, and there's more openness from physicians to be on the receiving end of information from the industry. And I do see that really taking a foothold. There will always be room for face-to-face interaction, but I do see how digital interaction actually is a win-win for both parties.
For the MSL connection, very interesting.
I do think that it's important that we use right now, or the moment that we are in, as a burning platform to learn the best version of what this looks like. And right now we're probably still very much in a crisis mode where we don't even have the opportunity to really connect face-to-face. But I think where we want to take the Alexion organization, whether that is within sales or access or medical affairs, is to simply be great across all channels, so that we learn everything we can right now, and then we can pick and choose based on what the customer needs. And I think you will have customers who will purely choose virtual because they find the flexibility in that, but you will also have stakeholders that want to continue to work with us face-to-face once we're on the other side of the pandemic. And I think as a company, we need to be ready to do both, or even find a really great mix, which means we need people that are incredible agile in understanding the needs of the stakeholder ecosystem, so that we can respond to that, not according to what we believe is the right thing, but according to what they believe is the right thing. And maybe one thing, exactly. And I think, you know, we announced not too long ago in Alexion that as a principle, we're actually working from home until July 2021. And instead of being shocked about that, we kind of rallied and said, thank you for the clarity. This is actually phenomenal. And it means that we will spend not every waking hour, but many waking hours trying to solve what virtual engagement looks like when it's really high quality, because we will be at home for a long time, right? So we have to figure it out. And I think that's actually pretty interesting, how a burning platform creates the need to come up with something new.
It does, but also the clarity that if you say, right, this is it till July, we better find it out. It's that
exactly.
That's very, because it's some people are being a little bit more vague, I guess, about it, saying you may come back, you may not. But it forces you to find those methods of listening more to the stakeholders.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to come on to our third topic that I mentioned earlier on, which is about the internal organization. I mean, partly we've been talking already about some of the ways that you've forced to find creative digital solutions, but often, pharma organizations, and I'm not talking about rare diseases necessarily, but just pharmaceutical organizations generally, can get a little bit siloed, that each has their own expertise and everybody does their own thing. And, rather than more integrated and connected with each other. And I just wondered if there's anything about the rare disease model for making that integration happen and making it all be aligned with the patient that you folks can share, that says this is how we do it to make sure that we're all aligned rather than siloed to do the right things in terms of our internal ways of working.
And John, when you talk about silo, do you mean siloed within the company?
Yes,
like between the different functions?
Now. Yes, within the functions of the company, and sometimes it's creating a new function, maybe a patient officer function. Sometimes it's making sure that the medical affairs and the access and the sales and the marketing all work together more effectively. But I think there's a need for this more integrative approach, as we talked about in the earlier part of the conversation. It'd be just interesting any models and ways people have managed to achieve that within their organization, so you're all aligned on the right thing.
Yeah. So John, I think the organization alignment needs to happen at many levels, because as you point out, the siloed organization can have the benefit of being kind of focused on one silo, one task, one accountability.
Yeah.
But obviously the patient doesn't think like that. I need to go to silo 1, 2, or 3. And that's kind of a recipe for failure, where people just give up when they feel they're being kind of siloed, and one side doesn't talk to another. So I think you do it at 2 levels. One is at the strategy level, where you have, say, a launch team that works across kind of medical, commercial, distribution, manufacturing, and R&D, and patient organization, to make sure that for however we go to the market and go reach our patients or physicians, that there's a very common approach and everybody has input and clear and signed off on accountability, responsibilities, and outcome. The second part is on the execution, because you can have a great strategy, but if it's not executed in an integral way, it will fall apart. So what I've seen is the patient hub actually coming together on a weekly or a monthly basis to kind of review all of the patients where things are still outstanding and we've not achieved, full reimbursement, full administration of the product. So it's an afternoon where you sit in a conference room, and I attended some of these meetings where all of the issues that are preventing the therapy from being administered are being discussed. The solution is being discussed, and it's clear who's accountable for delivering that. And once you do that for, say, 80 patients in an afternoon, not only is it clear that we're going to advance patient care by a clear step of what needs to happen, also as a more senior person, you get the better understanding of the common thread of the issues that are preventing either the successful diagnosis, treatment, follow-up, recertification. And once that becomes a trend, you can actually then come up with either resources, solution to come through. So it's the integration at the strategy level and at the tactical level that gives that feedback loop to make sure the strategy is on track, and where it doesn't work, it needs to be recorrected.
Yeah, it's awful, and very cross-functional in that patient hub, as you say. Yeah, because I mean, if we take that patient hub also, I mean, we there are patient officers and chief patient officer type arrangements in some organizations. It'd be good to hear about that, because again, that's another way of getting that voice across the organization. Any experience of that anybody would want to share?
Yeah, I think in Alexion, we've had a pretty exciting journey when it comes to this. First of all, we have a patient experience team. We have some processes that are called LEAP, where you also involve the entire local organization in deep diving and experiencing a patient journey. And the community you create around a specific disease, when it's not just sales, access, or anyone who's customer facing or stakeholder facing, but actually every single function in the company, really create some new insights that we can act on. And at our EC level, we have a chief human experience officer, which is obviously a shared officer between people experience and employee experience, and that's where our patient experience team sit, and it connects really well across who we are, who are our patients, and how do we create insights through that.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. Because I think it's, again, just getting that through the organization, I think is really good. And you know, everybody lives and breathes it. There's nothing like connecting with the patient in a very clear way across the organization there. And one of the thoughts I think with rare diseases that is slightly a different angle here is it by definition almost it has to be global right from the beginning. I know we're talking about people from all over the world here, but it's really interesting that you cannot be, you have to be local at some level, but you also have to be global in your approach to this engaging the ecosystem. And it'd be good to hear how you've managed across different borders, because I mean that's slightly, you know, I was thinking of functional silos, but organization you have to manage across. So the European folks and the US folks and the Asia folks and so on. It'd be really interesting to hear any mechanisms you guys have to make sure that you really operate as a truly global rare disease players, because it's more pressing, I think, for the rare disease community than perhaps in other pharma companies.
One of the simple things that unites all of us in a company and to some extent in the rare disease field, the glue between the silos, be them by function or be them by geography, is it's patients. And the fact that we can get to see patients, get to understand patients more because they have a name, they have a face, because there's a few of them and their predicament is significant, is at heart what makes everyone work well together, because there is a common goal of trying to find a solution for these patients and the disease, which is a bit unique to rare disease, of course, because when you're into primary care, you have slightly less exposure to the patient, the unmet need is lower. But in our case, you do everything you can to alleviate a very, very severe level of unmet need. So that, in a way, kind of trumps borders or trumps functions if everyone is shooting for the same goal, which is to make a difference to the patient. So if you have the culture in place that really put patients at the center, your colleague to be in Europe, in the US, in Asia, in the end, it's just a type of difference. But at heart, you're motivated by the very same things. So there's an understanding of how to work together that come with that shared goal.
So a really global shared goal. But you mentioned, I think, information as being the glue that's sort of almost holding it together, rather than necessarily the, you know, the actual people. Well, you need the people talking with each other, but there's an information glue as well. It'd be good to hear more about that.
Yeah, I was referring mostly to the glue being what the goal of addressing the patient needs, and that trumps everything else, because the need is so high that you cannot but feel emotional about when you get patients to come to testify, or carers, for the patient with a severe rare disease, and everyone ends up in a semi-tears after an hour of listening to the patient and the families. So that's the very strong motivator, a strong glue between the teams.
Yeah.
One important element I think that should not be forgotten, and Alexion and Orchard are companies that have a very strong culture and a passion for the patient. And what a chief patient officer actually does, it's not only, which is very important, provide the information to from the headquarters to the patient in a consistent way. So that country A is the same thing, country B and C. Ensure that there is a compliant way of interacting, because there are examples how not to interact and examples how to interact, and a chief patient organization officer can do that. But one real important element is the opportunity for the chief patient officer to communicate the culture of passion for the patient that exists in the whole company as an ecosystem, and ensure that passion and culture is communicated to the patient organization. Because as we all know, culture eats strategy for lunch. That passion culture that the patient organization can get done, and I think, you know, Orchard and Alexion are very effective in that, really helps channel that culture of passion back to the roots of the patient that we're all trying to serve.
And just to add to that, what Vlad said, I think it creates this culture of where we have to talk about the patients, and it's our obligation to put the patients at the center. And that has created some very different types of discussions and decisions, which is incredibly important. But John, I'm actually always coming at the patient discussion from a perspective that there are no global patients, they are all local. So unless you fix the understanding of what a patient journey is globally, and you actually create that very local ownership of what that is, you will actually never have the local organization truly feeling what these patients are going through. And I think that's where we've created a really powerful connection in Alexion, so that the patient journeys are not global, they're very local. And in some countries, they're even regional within the countries, because the way you treat patients in rare disease can be actually very different. So we've made it as local as we possibly could to create that ownership and experience to actually truly walk in the shoes of the patients.
Very interesting. I guess the global issue comes more at the level of perhaps some of the pricing issues that start to appear, but the administering the patient and making sure the patient gets the treatment feels very local or sub-local almost, which is, and that means a much more empowered organization. But I think it's great to hear what, you know, also what Vlad's saying about, if you have the global culture as this patient culture and the passion about the patient, then that feeds its way into the local operating model, and enables everybody to be sure that you know, at least locally they are finding the right patient journey for that. Because I think we also hear of companies that sort of get the families and the patients to come and meet the organization and talk with the organization. It's funny that happens in rare diseases, but it's perhaps less frequent in perhaps a more larger, certainly primary care setting, or even specialty. It's much harder to facilitate that, but because it's so important in rare diseases that you can actually do that, to get these patients and families to come and talk to the organization, it really helps the culture to evolve to be that patient-centric culture. So very interesting, recognizing it's local but also patient-centric. I'm conscious we're about 1 or 2 minutes out of time to go. So I think what I'd like to say is that, you know, we've covered a lot of ground here in terms of the patient-payer ecosystem and physician ecosystem, making sure facilitating collaboration in that world, and then the COVID context being actually paradoxically almost a burning platform to be more digital and be more engaged, and actually may see some advantages of the long term of a better engagement with all the stakeholders. And finally, on the internal front, this way of getting the culture and the infused throughout the organization and then out through to the local organizations that are engaging with their very local patient journeys. I think it's a fascinating insight into the future of the industry, which is very much more engaged, multi-stakeholder, you know, really local in terms of understanding patients. So I'd like to thank very much the panel members here for making some very powerful insights and conversation here, and wish all of those listening well with engaging better with the patient, physician and payer ecosystem in whatever field you're in. And thank you again for listening, and thank you again to the panel. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Bye.